Hi, I'm Gabriel,
And I'm Mauricio.
and we are the team behind Eros Unchained, a documentary series about the influence of erotic magic on advertising.
We want to begin by thanking Peter at the store for allowing us to use his space for the premiere of the extended trailer of a documentary series. This is a 25-minute piece edited from a 6-episode version of the series, which has a total running time of 3 hours and 20 minutes.
If you like it and want to learn more about the topic, you can go to our video Erotic Magic and Mass Media posted in this channel. Also, if you are a distributor or a platform and you are interested in our project, you can write to the email in the description. We hope you enjoy the extended trailer. If you do, join us for a group conversation right after the premiere.
The ancients spend much of their time looking up at the cosmos and its spheres. At the time, it was believed that at birth, souls detached from their original home in the Imperium, the highest of heavens, and plummeted into the sensible world. On their descent through the cosmos, an elegant framework of concentric spheres, with the Earth at the center, the souls picked up the essence of each planet, which would mark their temperament and inclinations during their earthly stay. Both the stars and the planets, as well as the human spirit, are composed of a subtle quintessence, a fifth element called pneuma. This affinity between the spirit and the stars is the bond that ties the human to the divine and allows for the operations of magic. The pneuma, subtle enough to not be a body, but non-body enough to be almost soul, is in charge of carrying the sensations that the sense organs collect from the outside world to the proton organon, an organ located in the heart, where they are turned into phantasms, mental images that can be understood by the soul. It is around this pneumatic apparatus, composed of the proton organon, the pneuma, and the phantasms, that a theory of perception is cemented that would last well into the Middle Ages. The close relationship of these phantasms of the imagination with the pneuma, their natural environment, led to the latter being characterized as a mirror in which the images captured by the senses were reflected. In this very vein, Plotinus, the great Neoplatonic thinker of late antiquity, declared that the conscious perception occurs and originates when thought reflects itself. That is, when the principle that acts according to the life of the soul is, so to speak, flung down again and becomes like the reflection, resting on the smooth and shining surface of a mirror. The manipulation of these pneumatic phantasms and their effects on the mirror of the soul are the basis of the erotic magic that we will deal with in this documentary. In this type of magic, the magician is seen as the hunter of souls, or animarum fanata, and the victim of his spells as the prey, which is why Giordano Bruno, one of the great magicians of the Renaissance, issued an important warning. Be careful not to change yourself from manipulator into the tool of phantasms. That is, be careful not to change yourself from the hunter into the hunted. Centuries later, it is in the poetic tradition of courtly love that we find a refuge for the pneumatic phantasms of antiquity. This tradition no longer emphasized the relationship between vassal and feudal lord that characterized much of medieval literature. Instead, it focused on the knight's infatuation with a distant and inaccessible lady who was usually married to his king, a forbidden relationship that could never be consummated. Thus, the knight exalts and idolizes his beloved as if she were an angelic or supernatural being. That is, he worships her phantasm in order to climb the spiritual heights and meet the divine. Courtly love disguises a divine love in an earthly one. It does not seek its physical consummation, but the exacerbation of the lover's passion through the phantasms of the beloved in order to ascend spiritually and escape from the world. In time, this escape route, which traced a journey back to the highest spheres of the cosmos, would eventually close, entrapping the believer in love in a pneumatic circle that would ruthlessly bind him to the sensible world, the realm of desire. Seen in this way, falling in love is a fantastic infection in which the image of the beloved, transformed into phantasm, penetrates the lover through his eyes, completely invading his pneuma and transporting him to the divine. But at times, the phantasm of the beloved penetrates the lover, emptying his soul and replacing it with its own. Besieged by these images, the lover becomes a simple carcass, invaded by the parasite soul of the beloved, which in time becomes its murderer. This similarity between unrequited love and magic led Marsilio Ficino, the architect of the Neoplatonist Renaissance of the 15th century, to declare that love is a magician. But it is Giordano Bruno who essentially later would set the standards with which erotic magic would be transformed into disciplines such as psychology, advertising, and public relations. For Bruno, Eros, understood in its broadest sense of desire, is the bond of bonds, a tie with which one can bind the victim of a spell in order to manipulate his or her behavior. This is how a hunter of souls can deploy a pneumatic network of bonds to entrap an individual, or even a mass. These bonds, or lures in the language of the time, are the functional principle of the erotic magic of the Renaissance. Centuries later, the pneuma of antiquity will reappear in more scientific disguises. Indeed, the Newtonian concept of universal gravitation, the principle that holds together all the bodies in the universe, is forged in the heat of a more ancient fire, that of the anima mundi, or soul of the world. According to Newton himself, gravity is the expression of a divine will, an infinite and omniscient spirit in which matter moves according to mathematical laws. Such infinity and omniscience are the fundamental attributes of the soul of the world, stripped of stultifying magical influences and adorned in mathematical law. Newton was not the first scientist. He was the last magician. A century later, at the edge of modernity, German physician Franz Anton Mesmer coined the term animal gravity to refer to what in pre-modern times was known as pneuma. In fact, Mesmer had discovered, or, to be more precise, rediscovered, what the Chinese and Hindu had known for millennia as ki and prana, respectively. A vital energy that animates the world and is assimilated through breathing. Soon, animal gravity turns into animal magnetism, and Paris is taken by storm. The influence of this healing technique should not be underestimated: the magnetic trance, a state that some people went into when applied this force, led to the discovery of the hypnotic state, and the development of both hypnosis and spiritism. In turn, hypnosis was an essential influence in the development of depth psychology, as it points to a hidden portion of the psyche that was later investigated by Freud and Jung. The Renaissance magician has become a psychoanalyst, a magician capable of both healing the individual and manipulating the crowd. According to Gustave Le Bon, one of the pioneers of mass psychology, a psychological crowd is a provisional being, composed of hundreds or thousands of human beings whose pneuma has been distributed by their autonomous nervous systems, and which operates, to a greater or lesser extent, unconsciously. Whoever controls this collective pneuma, the soul of the crowd, will be able to command it. But to successfully implant an idea in a large human group, it must be encoded in phantasms, mental images capable of penetrating the group's soul, the collective pneuma. In this way, Le Bon clearly defines the most effective instrument for creating these images: the spectacle. This operation requires a new host and a new context to prosper. This will take place in the United States, and its main agent will be none other than Sigmund Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays. The work of Bernays is based on a very simple idea that was already in the air: replacing the economy based on need with one based on desire. The key to the success of this paradigm shift lies in the skill with which Bernays intuitively uses the precepts of pneumatic magic to create new instruments that penetrate the collective pneuma through a complicated network of libidinal bonds. Eros, since then, has remained unchained. The similarities between erotic magic and the work of Bernays are fascinating. Just like erotic magic gives the image a higher order than language, so that ideas must be transmuted into something easy to remember, into phantasms, Bernays takes this theory further and refines the language of advertising into something akin to an image language. That is, a linguistic sequence so simple and easy to remember that it practically works as a phantasm. The slogan. Once the idea of desire as the new engine of the capitalist economy has settled, it is easy to see that the so-called American dream is nothing but a spell of perpetual prosperity and abundance that feeds on the desire it constantly produces in its subjects. A sort of fairy tale to live in. This is how advertising becomes the official manager of public desire, making the companies created to offer this endless procession of goods, the advertising agencies, the exoskeleton of the magicians who operate behind them. In this petri dish, a concept is born that represents a new milestone in the achievement of mass hypnosis: the birth of branding. Following Le Bon's thesis that the psychological mass is a being endowed with anima, companies begin to consider the goods they produce as secondary, creating a brand, a general identity for them that grants them their own soul. The disintegration of the activities of the ancient hunters of souls into different units, as it happens in the advertising agency, gives this organization the advantage of not having a consciousness that could fall prey to its own spells. That is, of turning from hunter to hunted. The various tasks of the advertising agency become modern derivations of the ancient magical precepts for weaving bonds. In this openly consumerist environment, the performing arts become a tool for the democratization of desire, creating whole sectors of reality where consumers may be submerged within this or that advertising spell. Our world has become a cage, a demiurgic bubble in which consumption constitutes the core of all human activity. This bubble of unreality, woven by the demiurges of consumer culture, is a zone of indistinction between reality and fiction, in which the consumer must suspend his or her credulity in order to accept the internal logic of the new hybrid reality. But this is not all. Beside leading us to lose the notion of what is real and what is fiction, advertising spells also rely on the illusion of participation, which make us co-creators and therefore accomplices of the system. It is for this reason that the consumer not only consumes the products on offer, but feels the need to show them off as an integral part of his or her identity. The phantasms created by the demiurges of advertising have invaded our pneuma. They have conquered it, like the beloved of courtly love, to the point they have devoured our soul and replaced it with their own. Now, what would happen if the phantasms of advertising became self-aware and grew independent of those who created them? In fact, this has already happened. In the 21st century, we assist to the birth of the phantasm in the machine. To understand this, it is necessary to go back in time to the Renaissance. At the time, the art of hiding and deciphering secret messages, known as steganography, was considered a branch of mathematical magic. Centuries later, this form of magic would prove essential to the development of cryptography and information technology. On the other hand, it is the idea of the anima mundi, or world soul, an entirely pre-modern notion where we find the origin of digital networks. The anima mundi was understood as a community of the universal spirit, of the pneuma, which gave cohesion to the cosmos through Eros. This idea passed in the 18th century to the natural sciences, in the form of the biotic community, which would prove essential for the emergence of our current concept of ecosystem, developed by the British scientists Arthur Roy Clapham and Arthur George Tansley. Tansley in particular was prone to applying mechanistic metaphors to the natural world, and, in fact, his concept of the ecosystem was influenced by the idea of the human brain as an electrical network. This analogy between an electrical grid and an ecosystem ended up forcing a mechanistic point of view upon the natural world, falsifying it. The anima mundi turned into an anima machinalis. This is how modern technology became a mechanism that at its most basic level is able to reproduce magical erotic processes. In fact, the history of the transformation of the pneuma into information is also the history of the creation of the cybernetic narrative and its influence in the 1960s counterculture. This influence is evident in artistic collectives of the time, such as the Us Company or Usco, led by poet Gerd Stern. In this group in particular, the conception of information and electricity has begun to take on a metaphysical tone and is understood as a sort of mystical energy. This identification of the Renaissance pneuma with electricity and digital information is essential to understand the transformation of the pneumatic network of bonds into our current digital networks. Now, it is important to emphasize that the transmutation of pneuma into information has an overtly religious dimension. The arrival of pneuma to the digital realm implies a sort of incarnation of the spirit. Of course, there are two sides to this metaphor, and the opposite idea, that the virtual world is a kind of dematerialization of the body, is also valid. What looks like a virtualization from the point of view of the flesh is an incarnation from the point of view of the spirit. The functioning of social networks can be easily inscribed in a particular myth, that of Narcissus. We have all heard the story of the beautiful young man who falls prey to his own reflection. From a psychoanalytical point of view, Freud understands this myth as a psychological process, the enclosure of the self in the libido. However, once desire was democratized with the consolidation of consumer culture in the early 20th century, a new iteration of the myth of Narcissus emerged: the display window. Nowadays, the translucent surface where one's own phantasms or the beloved's used to be reflected is transformed into televisions and movie screens, and more recently, into smartphones, tablets, and laptops. The dialectic is identical, whether it is a commodity displayed in a shop window or in a feed of a social network. The surface, like the water mirror of Narcissus, reflects the totality of the desires and aspirations of the beholder. This reveals a fundamental matter. Both erotic magic and digital networks are forms of autism. The democratization of technology has led to the emergence of a new type of hunter of souls, the influencer. A consumer commodity famous for his or her ability to collect likes and views on social networks and thus move the masses towards the most diverse products, services, or ideologies. Thus, the democratization of desire implies the democratization of pneumatic manipulation. In this context, the phantasms of old become selfies, videos, and digital marketing campaigns, which go viral in the form of hashtags. Everyone's life becomes a human-scale spectacle, a personal commercial filled with the digital editing effects to make it more alluring for everyone else. Advertising becomes ubiquitous and invisible. It intertwines with everyday life. In our time, new realities, let's call them demiurgic bubbles, can be created by anyone with access to a smartphone. But the human animarum venatus still has some cards up their sleeve. Following our analogy of the mirror, if we do the exercise of passing through its polished surface and peer into the other side, we will find the original discipline on which public relations and advertising are based: propaganda.
Hey Boris, you alright?
I'm good, how are you?
What's been on your mind today?
If the former would not have been possible without the latter, in a fair act of feedback, today, the latter would be impossible without the former. In fact, it is thanks to the immediacy and effectiveness of the internet that innovative methods of mind control, very different from what we've mentioned so far, have flourished with the sponsorship of the great political powers. Particularly significant in this regard are Putin and Vladislav Sodakov's Russia and the United States under Donald Trump. These are the true demiurges of the 21st century, who have submerged the population with their particular spells in a set of scenarios, where fiction and reality have intermingled in such imaginative ways that the common citizen is no longer able to tell them apart. Perhaps our present situation represents, more clearly than ever, the theatre of dancing shadows that shaped the reality of the men chained to the Platonic cave. With our constant exposure to phantasmagoric perception, to the shadows of reality, we are tied to the most elementary stage of alchemy, the Negredo, where all elements of philosophical gold are at their most elementary and coarse. So the more pertinent question here would be, what is our motivation to return to reality?